So, welcome everybody. My name is Brett Benjamin. I am a faculty member in the English department. I'm a former UUP chapter president, and I'm currently the grievance chair, and I'm a member of the UUP Albany Executive Board. And so I'm really proud today to kick off our sequence of events that are in solidarity with the call that was put out for the Scholars Strike for Racial Justice. That's happening today and tomorrow across the country, probably internationally as well. I posted a link to the Scholars Strike website in the chat. You can kind of go and check it out. They've got some resources posted. It's not an extensive list, and it's a lot of media pieces that you may have run across from the Times and the Atlantic and so forth, but it's helpful nonetheless, and it's helpful to get a sense of putting this conversation in relationship to broader conversations that are taking place today and tomorrow, and that have been taking place for many years, as Victoria will talk about in just a second. I'm super pleased that Victorio was able to do this presentation. He is a friend and a colleague, somebody for whom I have an enormous amount of respect and admiration. He's a poet. He is an activist based here in Albany. He was one of the co-founders of the New York State Prison Justice Network. And so worked for many years, has worked continually for many years on mass incarceration and prison abolitionist questions. He was the executive director of the Social Justice Center of Albany for 11 years and helped that really amazing organization gain stability and continuity and provide the amazing resources that it does for our community. In his role with UUP, he's the Director of Writing Instruction at our campus's Educational Opportunity Program, EOP. He's also a candidate for his Doctorate of Philosophy in the English department where I teach. So he's a man with many hats and an enormous amount of experience and careful thought and action over many years that have given him a real depth of commitment and expertise with which to address the questions of racial justice that we as a campus face right now, that we as a country are facing right now, and that really shape the world in which we live in. So I'll turn it over to Victorio. My plan is to stay out of the way as much as possible. I'm gonna serve as a moderator, so I'm gonna keep stack. If you have questions that you want to ask Victoria, you can raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand feature. If you click on the participants list, you'll see a batch of icons. You can raise a hand. I'll put your name down on a stack and unraise your hand so that they're not all up. You can also text me or chat me to say you've got a question. I'll keep that, and I'll kind of keep discussion rolling after Victoria is done. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to friend and colleague Victorio for his contributions. Thanks, Victorio.
I almost did that thing where you start talking for a few seconds on mute. Glad I caught myself. So I know we've all been there. Well, thank you. You know, you put a bunch of praise onto me that is not deserved, but I appreciate it regardless. And Brett is the person, you know, to blame for the fact that I'm here at getting my PhD at UAlbany. So he's the person I blame for my misery. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, he's the person who you know, his work in the university overlapped with work in the activist community. And he was the person I sort of talked it through this idea of coming up to UAlbany and getting my PhD. Which led to me getting my position in EOP, which, you know, is the Educational Opportunity Program. So I'm happy to see, I see here there's colleagues both from the English department, colleagues from the EOP program, other colleagues who I've met around the way in various capacities, and some of my students, and as well as students of students who I know who are currently not my students. So great to see an excellent and large group here to talk. So one thing I hadn't thought through when I talked to Brett about how we're going to facilitate this is that I often, when I do talks, I do a little bit of sort of Socratic piece. So I think what I'll do is I'll do that, and that's not the sort of the Q&A part, which he'll take stack for. This is I'll rather sort of I can sort of field as I ask, sort of throw out some questions to you guys. I can field people, and honestly, I prefer jumping in rudely as opposed to raising your hand. I think for a Q&A, raising your hand is very helpful. But so I say that to say I'm going to ask some questions of you guys. So if I do, feel free to jump in. And Brett, feel like you can feel that you're off the hook on managing, facilitating in that aspect. So so the talk of this is I don't know, can't remember the exact title, but it's something to the effect of building a prison abolitionist movement. So I think the first question to throw out to make sure we're aware, let me rewind a little bit. One of the things I find in the university setting is we oftentimes talk about key terms as if everyone in the room knows them. And I think this is one of the things students really struggle with, especially. And so I find myself pausing a lot in class, sometimes taking 10, 15 minutes away from whatever we're about to talk about to just make sure we're fully understanding the terms. And so that's what I want to throw out here is do we know what prison abolition means? Can someone, explain what prison abolition is to me or to us? And I'm well rehearsed at just sitting here quietly and waiting. So that's not going to get you guys off the hook. And if nobody knows, what do you think it means?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think is it like when you're going against prison, like people who are put into prison, or like you want something to reduce. You want prison, like people being put into prison to reduce.
Yeah. I mean, thank you, Michael. Michael was a student of mine in the summer, not currently. So glad to hear you. It absolutely is in opposition to prisons, although we could argue whether or not it means to reduce them. I probably think it means something a little bit more extensive than that. Anyone else? And
Doesn't it mean?
All right, so Teresa, then Aiden.
I'm sorry. Doesn't it mean to move away from the prison system, into a more rehabilitative state kind of thing?
I think so. Yeah. And Aiden, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, basically what the previous speaker just said. It's a movement to rid ourselves of the current punitive jailing system and prison system and move towards more reformatory rehabilitative system with different programs and different ways in which we can sort of house potential criminals and actually make it so that they're not recommitting or reoffending after they're out of the prison system.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your chiming in there. I'll sort of want to bring you back to, oh my God, I might forget, 1996. I just moved to Albany for the summer. I had graduated college from Adelphi University. Shout out to Adelphi. I'm probably fairly certain I'm the only Adelphi alum here, but Chuck D from Public Enemy and Flavor Flav both fellow alums. So 1996, I moved to Albany. My father lived up here, had lived here for some time, but I had not lived in Albany at all previously. I had visited. And so when I moved here, I had got a job working with an AmeriCorps program, which was through the city of Albany. It was a summer program. And we had gone downtown for No, sorry. I did start in the summer, and then I worked on through the winter. So this is actually the winter. It would be 97. So the winter of 97. And it was MLK Day, and we had gone down to the plaza, and there was a big MLK event, and the governor at the time, George Pataki, was speaking. We used to have a Republican governor. Some of y'all may not know that, but we had him for like 12 years. And it was a blue state then too, but we did have him, and what an interesting time that was. But so he was speaking and saying the general platitudes that one says on MLK Day, that one would expect from a politician, right? We're striving to move together to build a more just world and fair world, all those type of things. And I see this woman in the corner of my eye, like yelling. And I look over, and this woman is holding up a sign, and it says, "No more prisons." And she's screaming at the top of her lungs. So I sort of stare over there. Her name is Dr. Alice Green. I did not know who she was. I had no idea. And so she's screaming, "No new prisons." And police come escort her out. And this is a room full of predominantly people of color, Black people, mostly Black Americans. There were, it was a mixed group, but it was the majority of people there were Black Americans from various schools and other programs. And George Pataki, his response was, well, we'll stop building more prisons when people stop doing crime. And he got a round of applause for that. And at the time, I was blown away because I had never thought of the idea. I knew that criminal justice system had problems. But I had never thought of the idea of just saying no more prisons, or why someone would say that. And so shortly after, I read the news article about her little protest, and in there she said, "I'm a prison abolitionist." And I had never heard that before. Those was totally new terminology to me. I obviously knew what an abolitionist was, but I didn't know there could be such a thing as a prison abolitionist. I say this for a few reasons. One, that day Alice Green was a lonely voice. And those of you who know who Dr. Alice Green, she's still doing this work right here in our community to this day. But that day, she was just a lonely voice. Appeared to be just talking at nobody who was listening. There was a room full of people. They didn't rush to her defense. People didn't start chanting, "Get out of here, Governor, you keep building these prisons and locking our people up." Nothing like that. Quite the opposite. And it was a very lonely voice, right? That stuck with me, and then I, began to, because I had been interested in activism. I was interested in various topics. A topic that's still very near and dear to my heart is the independence of Puerto Rico. I'm a Puerto Rican, and I support the independence of Puerto Rico to be its own independent nation. I was raised that way by my father. So that was an issue that was interested. I was very much interested in the struggle for the Zapatistas, who is a group in Chiapas, Mexico, who have attempted to create a sort of autonomous, different community within the confines of Mexico. And I was interested in other social issues, environmental issues, and what have you. And I had not had any real experience around criminal justice issues. I knew I was opposed to police brutality. I knew that was a real thing, and I knew I was opposed to that. But the idea that one of our problems is that prisons exist in the first place, that there is such a thing as a prison, that to me was mind-shattering. Right? And it took a while for me to really embrace this concept. I had to do more reading. I found out about the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, right? Which meant, if you are not familiar, there's a wonderful movie on Netflix about it called The 13th, so you can look that up. But yeah, I suddenly found that, read the 13th Amendment, that slavery is technically legal if you are convicted of a crime. And I started to see the prison system as an extension of the United States slave system. But when I was really sort of coming to this view, this is in the early 2000s, and this is just not a popular view. The prevailing narrative is that we have this problem with violence in our communities that has to be addressed. And that, yeah, maybe there were a lot of reform-minded people who thought, well, let's, work to try to address issues of police brutality, work to try to make prison conditions better and such, right? Which was understandable. But as you start to think of prisons as a form of slavery, it's hard to sort of go back and think about reforming that system. We all like to think, and we've done these thought experiments, all of us, I'm sure. We like to think that, if it was around slave times, that we would be the people fighting slavery. Now, obviously, some of us know that we would be the ones who were enslaved. But those of us who had the fortune, who are fortunate enough to be free, would we fight it? Right? And so for me, I felt this call, oh, this is actually my time. Like, I'm here. Slavery exists now. And so, for those early years as I was coming to this, I knew I wanted to do something about it, but I didn't know what. Which is starting to bring me to the point of our talk, right? How does organizing relate to movements, right? And how do we sort of understand ourselves and our roles within those contexts? I'll get into that, and I was gonna say, there's an ebb and flow with organizing. Sometimes, there's really big moments of social protests, and there's moments where those things die down. But so me and the people that I started to meet who were interested in this issue, we started thinking about, okay, what are ways in which we can organize around this, right? And the first thing that you have to sort of understand is that things did not look optimistic for us. We had no reason to believe that we were going to change public opinion on the issue of prisons. And this is important. If you want to ignore the rest of my talk, feel free. But if you pay attention to one moment I'm talking about, is to know that, right? That social movements oftentimes start at a time when it seems impossible that the objective of that movement can be realized. And I don't want to act like we can put the cart before horses if mass incarceration is over with it. It's certainly not, right? But now we live in a time where people are actively saying things like defund the police, end mass incarceration. You have protests in the streets, right? You have people talking about the new Jim Crow. But when we were doing this organizing in the early 2000s, the idea that would be a nationally accepted narrative, even if it's, a small group of people, but that there would be some sort of mainstream understood narrative that people actually want to defund police. It seemed impossible. It seemed impossible. And I think that's so important when we look at the organizing that's happening today. The things that people want to achieve may seem impossible. So I got together with a few people. It started with 3 people. And we started having meetings, and we were just talking about what were things we could do to try to change this narrative around this subject. And that, 4, 5, 6, 7 meetings like that. Group expands. Now we have 8, 10 people, right, talking about, these are just conversations. We're not doing anything. There's no protest. There's literally just meetings and talking, right? The thing we finally decided is if we could connect with other people who are interested in working on these issues, who are already working on these issues, if we could do that, then we might get somewhere. And we made a strategic decision, and I think this one was important for those of you who are interested in organizing. The strategic decision we made was we wanted to organize with anyone who was on our side of the fence. And when I say that, I mean prison abolition to this day is a very sort of, radical position, right? Most people don't support that idea. That was even more true 20 years ago. Well, we decided anybody who feels like the prison system is a problem that needs to be addressed, we want to work with that person. Instead of saying, only if you believe in the abolition of prisons are we willing to work with you. We decided that that was going to be too narrow of a group and that we were not going to get anywhere. And I think that strategic decision was probably the smartest decision that people I've been working with ever came to in organizing. And that idea, at least for me, I came to understand it through the Zapatistas as well. I told you I was influenced by them. They, I see the shout out about Oaxaca. Yeah, the Zapatistas, their model for organizing was multi-layered, right? So they had the people in their indigenous communities who they, were building community with and essentially fighting an active revolution with. But then they had layers of people they were working with. They had churches they were working with who were liberation theologists. They had observers who were coming from all around the country who they were working with. They had people online. It's really the first internet-based social movement. I mean, I don't want to say it was only based on the internet, but that had a strong base in the internet. So they were working with people in their own communities to educate people about their struggle, right? And the political perspectives of these various groups ranged between more and less radical. And instead of having this idea of you accept our philosophy full force or you're against us, they had a philosophy, if you see something that we're talking about that is important to you and valuable to you, join us and work on that. Right? And so we decided to build a movement in New York State. We would need to work that if we were just working with people who are prison abolitionists, we'd have such a small group, no one would care. Right? And so we decided to meet up with just a few people who we knew who were doing this work. And we started having, now our meetings grew up to about 16 people. A few organizations here, a few organizations there. We started talking, and then we said, well, we got to go to New York City because we can't be talking about New York State without talking about New York City. And we reached out to some people and said, hey, can you set up a meeting? Can we get other people who are working on these topics and get them together? And they were like, yeah, okay. And so we went there, and the first thing we did is had some people yell at us about how people from upstate always are trying to tell people in New York City what to do, which was an excellent experience because you have to be prepared for the fact that you're not always going to be well received, right? And we worked past that. And we found people who said, yeah, we want to work on a sort of statewide collaboration on this issue, right? And so then we started having conference calls, And before you know it, we have conference calls with 50 people on it. Because everybody was like, yeah, we want to work. We want to bring these issues to the forefront. We want to make them bigger. We want people to know what we're talking about. Everybody wanted that. And so instead of saying we're working towards abolishing prisons, we said we're working to connect people who are working on issues of prison justice. And that by making those connections, we can work towards our ultimate goal. And so what we did is we finally had built enough of a network that we were able to create what we called the New York State Prisoner Justice Conference, which was the first conference of its kind. It convened something like 60 organizations from across the state, over 200 people who were activists, had been working in the issues around prisons and police brutality. So we had people who were working on the school to prison pipeline. Do you know what I mean? Do people know what I mean when I say that? Can someone real quick tell me what school to prison pipeline is, so I don't just gloss over that? Or what you think it is? The silence confirms that I should pause and make sure we address that. Anybody?
It's the idea that that schools are targeting people for prison, or that they're seeing kids as bad kids, and that they're channeling them towards prison, I guess. Exactly right. Someone want to add to that?
Yes, if I could add to that, Dr. Mason. I think that students, if you're doing bad by third grade, right? If you don't have a father in the house, there's a bunch of factors, right? And so what they're trying to say is that there's two tracks. You have students who are being prepared to go to college, right, and succeed. And you have students, because of different circumstances, they're doing bad academically. They're literally going into the pipeline to go to prison. They're not really on track to seek gainful employment or college education.
That's right. So the truth is that there, yeah, I like it. You said there's two. I mean, there's probably more than two, but we could say there's two tracks, right? There's the track in school that leads students to college or to gainful employment, and there's the track that leads students to prison. And that policing starts in elementary school. That students are getting policed. That students are getting policed in elementary school. Right. So that's one of the issues. Police brutality, obviously. But then there's so many people working on various aspects of prison, right? So you have reentry. What's reentry? Come on.
When incarcerated people re-enter back into civilian life after their incarceration, the difficulties of that transition.
Thank you, right? Because that's a multi-layered process, right? It's not, you get out, well, where do you go? Where do you stay? How do you get a job? Are you in the same neighborhood, same community, around the same people that you were around before? All those factors, right? You have re-entry. You have solitary confinement, right? A lot of people are opposed to solitary confinement, see it as a form of torture, which it is, and I'll probably touch on that in a moment. People looking at just prison abuse, right? So there's actually a myriad of issues, and you have people who are working on like their little pieces all across the state. But those people had never really, I mean, of course, obviously, these various people, some of them knew each other, but they had never really worked collaboratively. And so we got everybody in one roof, and people kept saying, well, what's the mission of this conference? And honestly, we said, the mission of this conference is to hear from you. Instead of laying out the agenda, here's what we're going to do. Here's our plan. Here's how we we build a movement for social justice. We said, come here, come to the conference. We build it together. You tell us. And so that was a very sort of open organizing model, right? And it wasn't easy. People would get mad. They'd be like, well, what's your agenda? We'd say, well, and we did come up with an agenda. I don't want to act like we had about hours we spent on the agenda alone. But, people are like, what's the plan? Well, we don't have the plan. We think you can help us make a plan. We're not the leaders. And so it happened. We had this conference. Like I said, there were a myriad of issues. Oh, another important issue that I didn't mention was both LGBT and trans rights within the criminal justice system, right? We had a whole thing around bathrooms, right? Bathrooms were a big issue. Because on one hand, we had people who literally came from the South, who used to live in the South, who remembered having segregated bathrooms. And we had other people coming, right, who understood the sort of segregation issues around having gendered bathrooms. And that was not sort of, at the time, a necessarily neat fit for both groups to sort of understand each other, right? Making one group, feel uncomfortable about what bathrooms they're going to use versus another caused some tension. We worked through it. Right. So, this was a whole weekend meeting, and we had all sorts of people took everything down with markers and stuff. All that information actually got out, right? It didn't just get written on the markers then disappear, right? But actually everything was sent out to everybody who attended. And everyone, we had follow-up recap meetings and what have you. And what turned out was we created this thing called the New York State Prisoner Justice Network, which is still in existence today. It doesn't do what it did at the time. Part of the reason, though, is that from there, a movement grew beyond those of us who created this network. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, we're responsible for all of the social justice movement that has taken place since then. And of course not, But I can say in New York State, there's certain issues. Aging prisoners is a big issue on the state level that people are looking at. Police reform. Not police reform. Police reform's been around a long time. Parole reform. Reforming the parole system, right? Solitary confinement. Issues around incarceration for trans people. Those issues were all very minor issues that most people were not paying attention to. All of those issues are major issues in the state legislature now, with varying degrees of how much they will or will not get passed. But there are bills associated, sponsors, right? And large demonstrations that happen. And that's because these groups met up with each other beyond our meetings that we organized. They started organizing their own meetings. They started organizing their own networks. One of those examples is HALT, which is Stopping Solitary Confinement. That group went on to do the same things we did. They went around the state. They started meeting with people. They invited people to their events. They did the same thing to try to raise awareness about solitary confinement in New York State. So every single step that we took moved forward was advanced by others. And then I would go to meetings that I did nothing to do. I didn't do anything with. I just show up. I see all the people that we pulled together. But I wasn't the one who pulled them together this time. Other people did. We just got them in the room once. And so shortly after we had done that organizing, then the book, The New Jim Crow, became popular. Are we familiar with The New Jim Crow? Yes, no? The New Jim Crow, Color Blindness in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Let's just write that down for everybody. If for some reason you are not, please read. I'm just gonna give it its short name, and that's Michelle Alexander. That book became a resource for us, right? All of a sudden, people were reading it and realizing one of the fundamental principles that Michelle Alexander talks about, which is one of the things I talked about with you. She came to the issue of problems with the criminal justice system, believing that they were not as bad as they actually are. She agreed, which most people who were sort of liberal believed, that yes, there were problems with the criminal justice system, every level. We need to reform sentencing. We need to reform, there are all these things that needed to be addressed. And she thought that. But she walks by a sign being hosted by, I think, a student organization or what have you. And it says, you know, the criminal justice system, the new Jim Crow, you know, meeting tomorrow at 7. And she walks by it, and her first opinion is like, how irresponsible that poster was. Because she says to herself, yes, the prison system is bad, but to equate it, to make this false equivalency, to equate it to this horrific institution of racism actually undermines the work, the reforms that need to be made, because you're comparing it to something that's so much more evil, so much more intense. And then she starts doing research. And she comes to the conclusion that actually the criminal justice system is the new Jim Crow. That all of the data actually points you to realizing, no, that wasn't a correlation, right? It wasn't just a comparison. It was a factual reality that what we perceived happening under Jim Crow, those same things were happening under the criminal justice system. So that book became a resource because all of a sudden people start reading and it's opening their eyes. And I want to be clear, this is important. For some people, like I said, Dr. Alice Green being one, they already knew this. This wasn't news. But for so many others, it's totally brand new. Oh, wait, I'm sitting idly by while a Jim Crow system is happening down the street in Albany City Court? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And so all of a sudden there's all these reading groups that are popping up everywhere, and they're popping up in some of the craziest places, right? Some of the most white places you've ever seen. And all of a sudden now people were interested in this movement, right? And then you have the killing of Michael Brown and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And as the Black Lives Matter movement came to the fore, which is a movement that, you know, is far bigger than anything we had sort of conceived in our little you know, ecosystem of activism. But then there became a mass movement that was looking for ways to articulate its concerns. And that mass movement reached to things like the new Jim Crow, right? Reached to the writings of Angela Davis, who predated the work of the new Jim Crow by decades, or a decade plus. They reached to the people who had been doing this work to become informed about the topics people are most have articulated, right? So the term mass incarceration suddenly becomes something that is commonplace. And I hate, I'm about to disparage one of the people on the presidential ticket. I actually could disparage both of them, and unfortunately, they're the people I'm about to disparage are on the side that I intend to vote for. But you have at the Democratic Convention, you have this opening, this montage of Kamala Harris and all of the wonderful work she does, and one of the things they say is working to end mass incarceration. She's claiming that. We know the truth. The truth is that she actually helped build mass incarceration when she was a prosecutor, right? I'm not here to get into voting right now, but you know, fascism is real, and we can't pretend it away and act like, oh, that's not something we talk about. And so just because I'm criticizing one political party doesn't mean I also don't acknowledge the fascism that is we're currently confronting with the current administration. And I don't think we can brush that under the rug. So I'm not doing that. Now, though, you have politicians saying, I want to end mass incarceration. Now, we argue whether or not they're really going to do anything. But 20 years ago, they didn't feel the need to say it. Not only did they not feel the need to say it, the idea that they would even think about it was ludicrous. The idea that Kamala Harris would come on the stage saying, I'm working to end mass incarceration, no one would have thought that. Or Joe Biden. And so now certain topics, they are mainstream. And there are dangers when things become mainstream because sometimes they can get brushed under the rug, or people use platitudes and other ways in which to address it but not address it. Those are real problems that need to be confronted, and I know that's true. But that's not what this talk's about. And we can get into it if we want to. But what this talk is about is that these topics wouldn't be mainstream if people weren't willing to work on these topics when the idea that they could ever be mainstream was ludicrous. Right? And so I'll sort of leave my little discussion here with a sort of closing point. One of the ways in which I came to really understand this thing that I'm talking about is actually the issue of gay marriage. I certainly am not someone who could claim that I've worked extensively towards that issue, but someone who very much considers myself an ally to people who have. And I also know many people in the queer community who actually don't support gay marriage for the opposite reasons, not that they don't support gay liberation, but actually they think that partnering with the institution of marriage is in itself undermining gay liberation. And you know, so I don't want to discount that, because that's a real concern that people have. But when I saw New York State make gay marriage illegal, when I saw Governor Andrew Cuomo sign the bill, you had people who were praising the governor, praising the lobbyists who made it happen, praising the politicians who voted for it. And hey, you know, I'm not opposed to that. If you want to praise somebody because they passed a bill that that you support, that I'm fine with that. And you want to praise lobbyists who help make it happen. That's fine. But the thing that I felt at the time was what it entirely disregarded was that for decades and decades, gay and queer activists had worked on issues of gay liberation, including gay marriage for some. And the idea that any politicians were ever going to make gay marriage legal was literally seemed like the most absurd idea. The idea that gay marriage, when I was a kid, I didn't know many people who thought gay marriage would be legal in my lifetime in New York State. But it wasn't the politicians that made it happen. The politicians did the final thing. But more often than not, it was queer people asserting their right to be themselves in very small rooms, in very small groups. Be it pride organization at the University of Albany, or one at a small high school, or a little dance party thrown in someone's basement. That happened over and over and over and over again. And all that was met with was a cacophony of homophobia directed at people who continued to advocate for gay liberation. And politicians up into President Obama all affirmed that marriage could only be between a man and a woman. Then all of a sudden, everything flipped. And it flipped because people put in that work. And they put in that work in a time when it didn't necessarily mean the odds did not look good for their cause. And I wouldn't, and we're far from having achieved gay liberation. But I would say in terms of the issues around prison justice, prison abolition, we might even be further from the policies that sort of are equivalent to something like the legalizing of gay marriage. So we're in the middle of this movement, right? I don't want to act like we're at some sort of end point. We're not. But as I've seen us get from the beginning to the middle, I've become more and more aware about how much organizing is about doing things when it doesn't necessarily, the odds don't look good that you can change that particular issue. But you do it anyway. And you build bridges. So when you look on the TV, or I don't know who looks on the TV. I barely look at the TV. You look on your phone to watch the latest Facebook video that your friend posted about a demonstration somewhere, and you see people in the streets talking about ending mass incarceration, talking about Black Lives Matter. Remember that wasn't always the case. That this popular movement did not always have support. And we know it has plenty of oppositional force. That's obvious, right? But there's a lot of us who do support it. And that became possible because when it looked like there was going to be no support, there were people who were still fighting and advocating for these issues. And so, I guess the last thing to leave you on before we get into the questions is maybe you have a topic to you that's really important. Maybe there's a social issue that you think nobody's talking about. Well, if you put work in on it and you connect with the other people who are interested in that and you build from there, you might fast forward 10 years, 20 years, and all of a sudden you see presidential candidates talking about your exact issue back to you. Now, whether or not they're going to do what you want them to do, that's another story. But the first step is, can you get it on the table? What you do with the conversation, what's on the table, I don't know. Maybe that's a different conversation. Maybe we need someone else to help answer that. But this talks about getting the issue onto the table. So I guess I'll leave it there.
That's fantastic, Victoria. Thanks a million. I'll happily look for hands or people who want to send me chats for questions. Maybe I can start out with one to just kind of get the ball rolling while I take some stack and line up some people. We have about a half hour to talk more, so plenty of time for people to get ideas in. One of the things that I thought was, I mean, this relationship between insurrectionary moments of kind of mass protest and upheaval, which seem spontaneous, but that need to be paired with their long organizational histories. Like, I think this is one of the real important ways of conceiving of social movements and mass struggle, and it has a really long history, and it's you know, it's always there. It's always there. It's actually one of the interesting ways that academics and universities play a role in social movements. They're usually, honestly, quite marginal and in fact counter-revolutionary more often than they are on the side of right. But as you say, you know, part of what that long organizing work is drawing on the ideas that are built up and they're there. Michelle Alexander is somebody, you know, Davis, LeQuant, a whole batch of academics who helped kind of build a vocabulary around mass incarceration through activism and academic work, through being sort of scholar activists. And at the other end of that is a batch of student activists who are constantly being radicalized, and you know, the university can serve as a site for that kind of activism as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on what the university offers as a player in these long sort of struggles, both from the side of scholarship and the side of students, or any other direction. And as you sort of think through that, folks can raise hands, send me messages, and I'll get a stack lined up, and people can ask Victoria what they have on their minds.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that up, because I touched on, you know, I'm not someone who is, you know, really likes to, you know, I'm not someone who's a fan of the Democratic or the Republican Party, so I don't like to, you know, I'm careful, especially in a sort of academic context, how far we go into conversations about them. But when I said we can't ignore the fascism that's existed in our current government, I want to be specific, because they recognize that what we do is a threat. We just had the President of the United States, right, ban or try to ban. You know, I never know when he says he's banning something, is this even something he's capable, that he has the capacity to ban or not? So I never know. But attempt to ban critical race theory from diversity trainings, intersectionality. That's not little stuff. Not little stuff, because we know what history does to academics when they start targeting them in this fashion. We know what it does. We've seen it. So they know that what we teach in our classrooms is a threat. Sorry. I like to think many of us, not all of us, many of us, what we teach is a threat to fascism. It is an obstacle. And so absolutely, I tell my students all the time, my students are way more woke than students were when I was a student. I think they're less well-read, but more woke. They know, you know, concepts of intersectionality, mass incarceration, like they get that. Gender issues, complicated, nuanced conversations around gender dynamics, gender presentation. They're there for it. Part of that is education. The education we provide and the education we've provided to others who they've interacted with. You know, I think we probably hate on high school teachers too much at college. I think I do sometimes too much, unfairly. a lot of them are teaching these topics that we're talking about. They've already come with some of this. All right? And so, and yes, and the key is it's not the professors, it's the students. The students build movements and they use some of the vocabulary they learn in the classrooms, but they make it dynamic. It's not just on the page. So yeah, I think universities have a vital importance. The more you organize, the more you want to downplay the role of universities because we're so removed from the communities, even though we shouldn't be, we are. And so we know how campus activism and campus social movements are often very separated from the communities, which is true and a problem and should be addressed. But that doesn't negate the fact that certain discourse takes place and it really helps to shift public opinion and narrative, right? And so, yeah, I could not agree more that that the role of professors and students in social movements is probably now perhaps more important than it's ever been in the history of this country.
Thanks, Victoria. I've got Sam Ryder who wants to ask a question.
Okay, well, I'm nervous because I feel like Sam knows more about this topic than me, but I'll try to answer anyway.
Hey, Victoria. It's great to hear from you. Thanks for putting all this together, and thanks for, the folks in UUP for organizing this. I think it's great. I have, one, I'll just say, in response to the things you've said so far, like, I totally agree. It's so easy to get disheartened sometimes when we don't see, the kind of legislative reforms put into place that, seem so obvious to some of us. Or when we do and things happen like with bail reform and then there's the inevitable backlash and you start to see rollbacks. And, it can feel like, even when you get that victory, you're never safe, right? You have to keep fighting. So it's good to just stop and reflect it. Yeah, like how far we've come on putting these issues into the mainstream and, just the kind of political education and consciousness raising around these topics. It's good to just have a reminder of that sometimes. But the couple of things that I wanted to touch on are, something you sort of mentioned very briefly is, the conversation around prison abolition is sort of separate from the conversation around police reform or abolishing the police, which are, two veins of a kind of same conversation, I guess. These conversations tend to happen separately, even though, it seems to me like they're really inextricable and they go hand in hand with one another, but they seem to be happening in separate spaces. And like right now we have a particular moment where, police reform is really in the forefront of people's minds for obvious reasons. And it seems like sometimes like prison abolition can sometimes take a back seat, I guess, in that conversation, because, I think it's for a lot of reasons, but, part of it has to do with, the fact that people can't see the things that are happening in prisons every day. Whereas, we have viral videos of police brutality and, murders in the street and things like that. That force attention. So many things happen, like COVID outbreaks in prisons, which, people are writing about, but it's different. It doesn't kind of go viral in the same ways. And so I guess I wonder, like, if you could speak to, one, how you see the intersection of those two different conversations or two different movements. And then, what do you think about when it's, sometimes I notice like, it's the same core group of activists that are trying to do work on so many different fronts. And you kind of have to move from one thing to another. And so, even with groups in Albany, you see so many of the same people at meetings for different, different causes. And whatever happens to be, the thing that people have to pay attention to in that moment, sometimes the other things can have to take a back seat. And as an activist yourself, like, how do you manage that? those sort of competing pulls on your attention and your time?
Yeah, great question. And like I said, I was nervous because I knew that I was gonna, there's a lot for me to get to, and everything you said was quite valuable to discuss, right? So, I mean, I think, our organizing, we saw police brutality, prisons, school to prison pipeline issues, reentry, voting rights, all of those things are one struggle, and I would argue that in the sort of popular movement we're seeing now, I'm not saying that people don't feel that way, but that it's not what's presented to all of us. It's really a police brutality issue, policing, right? And so I think that's an opportunity, really. When people are coming to spaces where protests like this are happening, that's a great time. That's a great place to be handing out literature about prisons. That's a great place to be putting up signs about prisons and the injustices of prisons, right? That's a space to organize in, right? And a beautiful space to organize it, right? Much easier to organize in a space where you have a group of activated people already. So, that's one piece to that. I also think, there is a difference, right, between reform and things like abolition, right? And I think it's a fine line. But I think that the best social movements don't fight too many battles at the same time. This is something that, I don't know if you're familiar with George Jackson, but George Jackson had said, in response to, at the time, a lot of activists questioned whether or not Black people should work with white people towards the sort of struggle for the needs of Black Americans. And George Jackson's response was, one, I don't agree that all white people are my enemy. But even if you were right, why should I fight all my enemies at once? Right? And I've always taken that to mean this. Right? This person who's insistent on reform, who you disagree with because you think actually we need to abolish the whole system, if their reform moves things in the right direction, you should partner with that person. Less people in prison builds us towards abolition. So if there's a reform that gets less people in prison, you should jump on that. Because then you have more people to work with, more people on your side. Hopefully that person comes around and says, you know what, you're right, we got to abolish this whole thing, and then they help you work towards that. But if not, maybe they say, nah, screw you, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, then you could argue with them then. Right? So don't let, well, I know it's such a tricky, right? Because then I could, it gets to be a slippery slope where you're into this lesser evils argument and all that, and that's complicated. But the fact that bail reform exists at all, no one was talking about that on a massive scale 20 years ago. Nobody. And so what we learned in our organizing was like real, tangible, real life things can happen for people if you could pass some of those reforms. There's people out there who want to pass these reforms. There's people who are impacted, the most oppressed, who could benefit from those reforms. So we chose to work with those people. And so something like bail reform, even though they've rolled it back somewhat, the amount of people who have a certain level of more freedom from the criminal justice system, it's a lot. That's real life impact. That's kids who have their parents there on their birthdays. You can't ignore that. And so I think it's a balance. You have to hold to your principles, but I think that you have to try to find ways to work with people who are on your side of the fence whenever possible. Wait, is there another piece? Because I feel like there was a third piece actually. Hold on. Oh yeah, there was. Sorry. So I knew Sam was gonna do this. All right. So the third piece was about, like, how to get pulled in many different directions, right? And it is hard to maintain consistency, especially when it's the same people, right? Working on this issue, that issue, that issue, that issue. I'll say personally, I've noticed that there are more faces around than there used to be because of the burgeoning social movements. And what I take from that is this. If you see 20, 30, 40, 50 people demonstrating every week about a particular topic, and let's say those are all new people, 5 years from now, you might have 3 or 4 of them are long-term activists working in the community. You might get 3 or 4 out of 50. But you know how much work those 3 or 4 are going to do? Do you know how much work, how many people they're going to organize? Those 3 or 4. So when movements grow, at the end, when it sifts through, you might only have a handful of activists, true activists there. But they're going to make such an impact. So, I say, when you see new blood coming in, that's a time to amp up the organizing, because you're going to get some people who are they're going to be there to carry the ball after you. All right.
That's great. Inika has a question about restorative justice and thinking about some alternatives to mass incarceration. Inika?
Yes, hi, Victorio. Thank you so much. So I hope this doesn't take us too far off topic, but how do we begin to talk to people about viable alternatives to mass incarceration? I study periods in which people accused of harming other members of the community are accountable to that member's family and to the community itself. So I'm wondering, like, where might I go if you have ideas about books, or if you yourself have been working on such ideas? Where might I go to find out something about the thinking that's being done right now about reparative justice or restorative justice? What would it look like?
I mean, it's a great question, and was probably the biggest issue that we sort of bumped up against, right? Let me start with saying, I wish I had got to study some Shakespeare with you, and I only had got to study with Martha, so I wish that had happened, but either way, I'm glad we're getting to talk here.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, the number one issue is like, well, what's your solution?
Right.
And oftentimes, to be honest, we didn't always have a good answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certain things we can point to, right? Like you talked about, there's certain periods where people are accountable to people's families. There's also certain models in various sort of indigenous communities that have been in place, right? Where they have in Alaska, they have this really controversial but interesting sort of policies in place in Inuit communities there around restorative justice. I think the terminology a lot of people use now is transformative justice. But I will say, I have a lot of experience with the problems in it. Unfortunately, that's the thing, is when we try to create things, from scratch, we often fail. And failure can be a beautiful thing. I learned that from local activists. Some of you may know Nadia Lawson. She taught me about spectacular failures and how important they can be. But I've been in communities where people have engaged in restorative justice processes and transformative justice processes with people who've committed, acts of harm against others. And I've seen it go terribly south. And that's okay. That's not a reason to not pursue them. But it is a cautionary tale to know we have a lot of work to do, right? And so I guess what I would say is that I wish I do. I don't. I'm as much as I'm talking about this topic, I'm not a scholar of criminal justice, right? So I can probably tell you more about Langston Hughes and hip hop than I can, specific texts to read on transformative justice. But I will sort of leave that at that is where we'll have to move forward, is issues of transformative justice, reparative, restorative justice. There are models out there. South Africa.
Yes, that's what I was thinking about. Yeah, the African National Congress, the work that they've been doing has been fantastic. So.
Absolutely. And I know there are critiques of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is I don't think all of the work's been done. There are people doing this work. There are people who give trainings on restorative justice and transformative justice. Albany has actually had a restorative justice program for a very long time, a couple of decades, with very mixed results. There were moments where it actually was quite positive, some of the work that was being done in Albany. And then, we had a DA that was brought on who was supposed to help really bring it to the next level. And sadly, it seemed to go the opposite direction. So I think the whole picture is holistic, right? Because if we have restorative justice, but we're not addressing many of the root causes, why certain crimes do happen.
Yes.
We don't look at gender dynamics, gender issues, right? We're going to run into problems, right? And so there's more work to be done on restorative justice and transformative justice. At the same time, we have to do that work simultaneously as we're looking at the other issues, because we're not going to really solve the problem unless we, when you have high unemployment, you have low quality education, you have a certain amount of crime and violence. Now, crime and violence happens everywhere. I'm not acting like somehow it only happens in poor neighborhoods, poor communities. But when you have a high concentration of that, those numbers often increase, right? And so if we don't address those at all, we're not going to be able to have a good solution. But we also can't wait for the solution until we address those things. We have to start forming the solution now. So, I wish I had more specifics, but those are my thoughts. Another thing, obviously we look at the criminal justice systems in the Scandinavian countries, more humane systems, not perfect by any stretch, but the idea that like removing someone from society is in itself a giant punishment. And so therefore we don't have to also treat them horrifically bad once they're removed from society, that we can actually treat them as human beings. Right. So yeah, I hope, I did my best to respond there.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Building on that, I don't have anybody else on stack, so I'll kind of jump in and add to it. I mean, I think it's a great question, and it points, at the beginning you asked, what is abolitionism? What is prison abolitionism, right? And the thinkers that I have read and gained the most from, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, these folks who have a kind of Marxist heritage, but also a critique of racism in relationship to structures of capitalism, always want to tell us that, abolition is on the one hand a series of reforms, getting laws passed, getting bills done, getting things on the books. And on the other hand, it's a kind of utopian horizon about a bigger transformative possibility about what it would mean to reorganize our society, right? And that can't happen through a set of incremental reforms. It's going to have to require us to think big and huge about, like, as you say, the structural conditions that produce crime and punishment, but also the kind of society that we want to build outside of it, right? A kind of a bigger notion of transformative, revolutionary abolition, freeing ourselves from the binds that we're in now, right? And I think it kind of parallels what you were talking about before, that insurrectionary moments of mass uprising and the long organizing struggle that goes with it is paralleled and made analogous to the always ongoing struggle for practical wins and gains, but also keeping your eye on a bigger horizon about what a different kind of world outside of punishment, outside of the structures that produce certain kinds of inhumane violence might look like. I think Davis in particular, but also Gilmore, these are thinkers that have always kept that balance in a really wonderful harmony for me. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a real balance, right? And we deal with this in the political context too, right? If, like, well, not like what you're talking about is political, but I mean literally voting, right? And, you're a socialist and you got Bernie Sanders, but like, is that a socialism? Because that's the Democratic Party. We're always constantly dealing with this, like, how much do we sort of work within the system and how much do we sort of work against dismantling the system, right? And, I don't think I can really say, I have the answer on that. What I can say is I believe that one thing I've learned from doing this for, a little while is that you don't want to have too small a tent when you're organized. If your tent is too small, it will not be productive. So whatever ways you can make that tent a little bigger, and I think it does mean having to open it up to people who are have a less radical vision than yourself, and work with them. I think that's important, and I know that there's perils in that. There's perils with working within the system, that you get sort of dragged into the BS of that system. So I don't discount that, but I don't think that means you just. I think we opt entirely out and we're over here doing our own thing. I just don't think it works. So I think we can do both. I think we have to challenge ourselves to do both. We work sometimes within the system, but only towards very specific projects that are valuable to us, valuable to that we think in any way sort of speak to this new world we want, right? And we have to be vigilant, because we know the moment you start working on a particular bill or what have you, the moment that comes across the finish line, the more they want to change it and be more like the system that already is there, But also remember too, like we don't organize in a vacuum. And, I should have said this before, I touched on this, but the issue we ended up working on most heavily after doing that work in the New York State Prison Justice Network was parole reform. And the reason was because we reached out to prisoners. We got a mailing list of prisoners. That's the thing, is you can mail people in prison. I shouldn't even say prisoners. We like to say people in prison, because they're people who are in prison. They're not prisoners. We mailed people in prison and said, what do you want to see? And the overwhelming majority, not even close, said parole reform. Said, we just want a chance to get out of here. Just a chance. And the feeling I had was, as someone who believes in prison abolition, what a privilege to be like, well, I'm not going to help you advance this reform that, of course, is going to, get watered down by the powers that be and involve all sorts of compromises and this and that, right? But like, I get to hug my kids when they go to bed. And there's people out there, they want that. People younger than me who've got grandkids now. Because they've been in there so long, They were teenagers when they had a kid, and now they have grandkids. And they just want to hug their grandkids. I think we have to find a way to help them achieve that goal while building towards prison abolition. I think if we're just ignoring that, ignoring their needs, their immediate reform needs, to try to advocate for this vision of our vision of the world, A, I don't think we'll succeed. But B, I think it's irresponsible. And C, I think that those people who come out those people are actually going to the people who help lead us to the movement we want to see.
Smart and thoughtful for sure. I don't have anybody else asking to get on stack. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a final question? I'd be curious. I mean, Inika was asking about specific books around reparations, community restorative justice, and so forth. But you know, I've been thinking about, just as we've been talking, a few of the books on mass incarceration, on prison abolitionism that have you know, been resonant for me. And I can post some of those in the chat. I've kind of been scribbling them down here for a second. But maybe there are other ones that you have that you might want to recommend to people as places to do some further reading. That the things that jumped out at me are, in addition to Michelle Alexander's book, which you already mentioned, Angela Davis's work. She has several books and interviews and so forth. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, The Golden Gulag, Loic Raquant, Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, strikes me as a place to potentially turn for some of that restorative justice stuff. James Foreman has a book called Locking Up Our Own. There are probably others. You got other things you want to maybe point people to? I know you're sort of, it's off the cuff, but if there's anything that jumps to mind, put them in the chat and give people some references.
Yeah, well, you know, I'll say one. I think the best reading often comes from, you know, little pamphlets and stuff you get when you're organizing, right? Actually, some of the best stuff is there. So I will want to put the New York State Prisoner Justice Network website. Because we have a bunch of resources up there that I think are useful.
Yeah.
Let me get that. Even though it's, you know, it's not as in date as it, you know, we still upkeep it, but not as much as we used to. But I think that could be valuable.
That's great.
I will say the books that you recommended, you know, the books I would have recommended are the books you just recommended. However, I can't believe I'm about to do this, but I am. Since, you know, we're all scholars here, I think that, God, I can't believe this is happening. I think Foucault's theories on crime and punishment are actually, I think the concepts of standardization and normalization, the reasons for crime and punishment, panopticism. I think that there's a lot there. I'm not a Foucauldian scholar by any stretch, but I think that his analysis of the sort of the way in which bureaucracy plays a role in this, I think it's on point. And so not to be discounted, even though, you know, I you know, my goal is not to, every time someone says, you know, let's talk about this social issue, to then say, well, here's this theorist that, you know, we all learn up here at the academy that no one else reads about. You know, I try not to do that, but since you got all the other books there, you know, that's what I'm going to do.
Nice. Well, it makes perfect sense. Listen, let me thank you. And then
wait, I do have a book. Wait, hold on. It's right. There's what's his name? Give me 1 second. Oh, and now that you got me thinking, I'm like, so there's Paul Butler's Let's Get Free, A Theory of Hip Hop Justice. Let me put that in there.
Okay. You know, what we could do also is maybe, you know, when we post the link to this, we can compile a really short list of some of these things together as resources for people who are interested in the question. And I can get Aaron to get whoever's working on the website to post that alongside, so people have some other places to go.
Cool. And so I'll just say a couple. I'll say Public Enemy, Dead Prez, right? Hip hop is probably the places where we've seen the most impressive critiques of the criminal justice system, and these critiques often predate many of these books that we see.
Yeah. Quick announcement, which is that this is the first of a series of 4 Zoom meetings that our chapter is putting on in solidarity with this scholars strike. So Victorio kicks us off with an amazing session here. There's another one later this afternoon. I believe it starts at 2 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people in case they want to grab a quick bite before they get back on. Tomorrow morning on on Wednesday morning at 10, there's a session on a guided inquiry into the embodiment of white supremacy. And at noon, there's an open forum on racial justice in the workplace. The session coming up later this afternoon is on creating an anti-racist curriculum. So I want to thank Aaron Major in particular, who kind of on the spur of a moment tried to pull together some series on this crucial question. You know, it's not easy to organize stuff really fast. And it's possible, A, because of organizing work that Aaron has done, which allows him to kind of call and stuff, and B, people who are members like Victorio, who can step in and do incredibly thoughtful, informative, you know, important kinds of discussions on the spur of a moment. So thanks both to Victorio and to Aaron and others who helped put this stuff together. A great talk. We hope to see you folks at other sessions as well. Any last closing thoughts, Victoria, that you want to wrap us up with?
Just, you know, give a shout out to EOP program, because I see us well represented here. Shout out to EOP as always.
EOP is always well represented. They show up, man. It matters a lot. All right, how about everybody unmute yourselves for a brief moment and give our presenter Victorio Reyes a big round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Victorio Reyes.
Yes, thank you. Fantastic. Woo, gracias. Felicidades.
Excellent. So we'll post this with some resources on the web. We'll see you at other sessions. Thanks a million, Victorio, and have a great afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Peace out.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.